the Institute for Social Research, and I'm so glad that you could participate in the ISR Insights Speaker Series. This series is a forum for faculty to share their research to inform the public good, and today we really need this particular research, I would argue, given we have about 12 days to go, right? I want to just say a bit about ISR. We have over 300 affiliated faculty who conduct research that addresses topics such as wealth and inequality, race and racism, politics for sure, and public opinion, as well as a wide range of other topics that include things like teen drug use, economic behavior, aging, health, really the span of the social sciences, I would argue. A full schedule of our Insights talks is available on the ISR website, as well as recording of past talks in the series. And I know, Catherine, those are all posted, right? So should you want to review anything that you're observing today, you will have that opportunity, or to share with your colleagues. So we'll certainly post a video of today's event there as well. So I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers, John Barry Ryan and Yana Krupnikov. John is an associate professor of communication and media and political science. He's a faculty associate in ISR Center for Political Studies. His research centers on political communication with a focus on campaign communication, social influence and the news media, and that's certainly all of those topics, right? We could certainly use some insight. Yana is professor of communication and media and a faculty associate in CPS. Her recent research considers differences in attention to the news and differences in political expression, both on and off social media platforms, with a focus on the relationship between political polarization and attention to political news. She is also interested in journalistic decision-making and in particular coverage of polarization and democracy. They are co-authors of the new book, Partisan Hostility in American Democracy. That will be sort of the substance of what they'll share today, explaining political divisions and when they matter, which we certainly think is timely. And Yana was also sharing with me earlier today that she is getting many requests for her insights about the election and what might occur. Maybe that's all of our anxiety, right? We're like, Yana, tell us what's going to happen.
Oh my God.
So maybe you'll tell us what's going to happen. But also, I just really want to acknowledge that these two speakers are in high demand. And so it's very kind of them to share their time with us in a moment when others would really like to be drawing on their expertise. And just to close by saying they explore the strong partisan relationship and partisan hostility. And again, these are things that we really want to understand in our political environment today. We'll have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, and I'm going to turn things over to John and Yana. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you so much for this welcome. I do want to kind of offer a spoiler right from the start. Like, I'm not going to tell you what's going to happen in the election. So this is not going to be where the talk is going, unfortunately. But we are going to talk about this idea of polarization, which has been something that is really forefront, especially during this campaign. So just to start off in terms of what are we talking about in terms of polarization, what is this concept, what is this idea? We're talking about this idea termed affective polarization, which, as this paper suggests, affect not ideology, is the idea that partisans increasingly dislike each other, but it's not based on issues. It's not that people are getting more extreme, it's just that they dislike each other more. This idea has caught a tremendous foothold across disciplines. This paper by Iyengar, Sud, and Lelkish, published in fall of 2012, has now been cited about 3,400 times. In terms of how often academic publications are cited, this is a lot. Another paper, which is much more recent, there's been so much research across disciplines on polarization that there's been actually a review of all of this research and what it suggests. This is actually a much more recent paper. I think it's 2020, and it's been cited 2,700 times. Just for kind of our own consideration, we looked at the same issue of the Annual Review of Political Science and considered how many citations the other papers published in that issue are getting. And it's not 2,700. It is in the double digits. So this is a tremendously big topic. It's a tremendously big issue. Now, the next thing, though, that I might say might be kind of surprising. In all of this research on polarization, most people are considering non-political consequences. So what do I mean by that? People are looking at how the fact that the parties dislike each other affects our social relationships. There is research to suggest that there is an increase in what's known as social distance, which means that, for example, somebody wouldn't want to be friends with a member of the other party, and a really kind of almost to the extent that any survey measure is famous. There is a famous survey measure asking, how happy or unhappy would you be if your child married somebody of the opposing party? There's a lot of work on this idea. Research has looked at family tension. The Chen and Rolla paper, for example, suggests that during Thanksgiving, people were less likely to travel and spent less time when they crossed the territory into spaces where they would be with somebody of the opposing party, ostensibly. And Huber and Malhotra, as well as Shafranek, have looked at dating and roommate choices, as well as many kind of other social impacts on polarization as well. There's also economic. We've looked at economic consequences. There is a study on hiring. How much would you pay somebody of the opposing party if you were to hire them, as well as collaboration. So what this research is suggesting is that polarization, the consequences have been social, they have been economic, but it's sort of surprising when we think about the political consequences of polarization. What do we know about what happens to you politically if, let's say, you are extraordinarily polarized? What is happening to the US politically if we have more people who are extraordinarily polarized? So in our book, The Other Divide, we, for example, find that polarization is really, really heavily correlated with this idea of political involvement. People who are really, really polarized, and I will get to what I mean by really polarized and how many of these people are there, are much more involved in politics. They spend much more time talking about politics, expressing their political ideas. They get really angry at other people for not talking about politics, and they're very ready to tell other people that they are politically wrong if they are polarized. The other surprising thing that research has found is that, well, if we think about how polarization relates to people's views on democracy, the effects are actually null. In a paper, in a recent paper, it says 2003, but it's 2023. I've moved us back 20 years. And that's why it is recent rather than 20 years old. In a 2023 paper, David Brookman, who was just recently here to give a talk, and co-authors, for example, find that if you make somebody angrier at another party, right? So in an experimental setting, you create a treatment in which you suddenly make somebody angry at somebody of the opposing side, it doesn't affect how you feel about democracy. And so they suggest that the causal effect of being polarized, the causal effect of having negative feelings about the other side, doesn't make you kind of have less democratic attitudes. So maybe the answer is this, that partisan animosity, partisan polarization, disliking the other side, just affects your interpersonal relationships. You might be less friendly with somebody of the other side. You might not want to hire them. You might not want to have a relationship with them. But maybe, as Brookman et al. Suggest, it doesn't actually have any broader translations. Maybe polarization is just something that's shaping our social relationships. But I think this is a challenge. I think this is a really challenging argument to make. The Brookman et al. Paper and other research that has looked at these ideas have given people what I would term a temporary shock of either polarization or depolarization. Imagine you're kind of sitting in a laboratory or you're sitting in a room and something happens to you, right? For a second, you're made to feel worse about the other political party. That's a temporary shock. And this temporary shock might not kind of affect your democratic attitudes. It might not affect how you think about politics generally. We can think about this as sort of any temporary shock in a lab. If suddenly you were to enter a lab and you were to get just a ton of money, you would be probably really happy, I'm assuming. I don't know everyone in the room, but I'm going to make an assumption. But that temporary shock of getting a ton of money wouldn't really change your previous life. It wouldn't give you the experience of having lived as a really wealthy person. It wouldn't give you the experience of having seen the world as somebody who has unlimited cash. And so I think this is, right, an important point about these studies that create partisan anger in a lab. It's a temporary shock of polarization, but it doesn't change everything that happened to you before. You haven't really experienced the world as or politics as a really polarized person. So the question that we're going to think about here is, what about living as a person who has strong dislike for the other side? What if you actually experience the world on a daily basis as somebody who has animosity, as somebody who is polarized, as somebody who does have extraordinarily negative feelings toward the other party? And so this is our book that we co-authored with Jamie Druckman, Sam Klar, and Matt Lewandowski. I wouldn't look at this cover too closely. It hurts my eyes. So I'm going to switch the slide. But the book is called Partisan Hostility and American Democracy. What we're going to look at in this book is a series of questions. First, we're going to look at how do people who are what we term higher in animus, so people who more strongly dislike the other side. So Democrats who more strongly dislike Republicans, Republicans who more strongly dislike Democrats, how do they respond to new political events? And what we suggest here is that people who more strongly dislike the other side respond differently because they need two things. They need more affirmation that they are right. They need more affirmation that their dislike is actually important and justified. And the second thing is that they really need more differentiation. These people who more dislike the other side want to find more and more ways to signal that they are profoundly different from the other party, that they have nothing in common with that other group. This idea, right, is tied to a concept termed partisan directional motivation. People who more strongly dislike the other side are going to be much more likely to follow their party. They are going to be highly motivated to constantly kind of listen to what their party says, to affirm that their party is in fact the good side, and to differentiate themselves, to say, we are so different from the other side, they're going to look for opportunities, even in things that don't seem political, to do that. And so what we suggest in the book is that the more you dislike the other side, the more likely you are to do these things, to follow the party. But the second question is, right, if this happens, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily always going to matter. There are, for example, many ways to affirm that your side is right and to differentiate yourself from the other side and make lots of partisan comments on some social media platform in ways that might start a fight on that platform, but aren't necessarily consequential for politics. And so the second question we ask in the book is, okay, but like, when does it matter? When does it actually matter that we have these proportions of people who are extraordinarily polarized, who very much dislike the other side? So when it matters, we suggest it's going to depend on the context. It's going to depend on what's happening around you politically. And specifically, people need help following the party. If your goal is to say, we are the good side, I want to differentiate myself from the other side, you need cues from the party. You need the party to tell you what to do. You need these cues in order to know what people like you are doing, what your party is doing. You need these cues to tell you how you specifically point that you're the good side. And you need these cues to sort of say, how do I differentiate myself? How do I actually say that I am so different from this other side? But you also need something else. There's something else that's going to be really, really important here. And the second idea is one of motivations and personal stakes. So why is that important here? Well, if we think about following the party, we might sort of say, okay, well, I'm just going to follow the party. I'm going to do whatever the party tells me, and I'm just going to do it, right? That's my motivation. My motivation is to be a good partisan. My motivation is to be really different from the other party. But what happens if there's a conflict? What if just following what your party tells you to do might actually create a problem for you? What if following what your party tells you to do might create consequences, right? Might create personal consequences, might harm you in some way? What if there's an issue like, I don't know, a deadly pandemic, when following what your party is doing might actually create a problem for you if you are wrong, if there are high personal stakes? And so we suggest that this idea of personal consequences, how high the stakes are, how important the issue is, what might happen to you if you were to get it wrong, are going to shape how much you follow the party, even if you do want to say that your party is better, and even if you do want to say, I'm really different from the other side. And the third idea we suggest, the third condition, is that you also need to see politics. For you to kind of kick into this idea that I need to say I'm the good side, I need to be different from the other party. If I'm a Democrat, I need to show I'm not like the other Republicans. If I'm a Republican, I need to know what Republicans are doing, and I need to differentiate myself from the Democrats. You need to see something as being really political. And so what makes these people who are higher in polarization different is that they see politics in more places. Things that may seem apolitical to others are going to seem highly political for people who are high in animosity, which is kind of why we might see them speaking out and constantly raising their voices in places that we wouldn't have connected to politics. So how are we going to look at any of these things? So what we're going to do is we have a measure of how much people dislike the other side. And that's, I'm going to call our time one measure. And then once we had this measure, we're going to track how people respond to a lot of new and different political events. So this was our timeline. We measured how much people disliked each other, this idea of animosity, in July of 2019. We then re-interviewed these same people in April 2020 at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. We then re-interviewed them again in October 2020, and then we conducted a final survey with them in April of 2021. If you think back to this time, so much happened. And so in these surveys, we track how people respond to all of these different events. We're going to have about 2,000 participants across all 4 waves of our panel. This is our retention from wave to wave to wave. This is fairly within the range of survey retention over such a period of time. How are we going to measure the extent to which they dislike the other side? We're going to measure it in a variety of ways. We're going to ask them how they feel about Democrats and Republicans for something known as a thermometer scale, which asks you on a scale of 0 to 100 how you feel about the other side. We're going to ask them what kind of traits they associated with the other party, like trust, honesty, and so forth. And we're also going to have what's known as a social distance battery, which is those questions about how happy or unhappy would you be if you had a neighbor of the other party? How happy or unhappy would you be if you had a son or daughter who married somebody of the other party? What's important about these measures is that in all of these cases, we stress to people that we're not talking about politicians, that we're talking about ordinary people. Research suggests that this measure actually varies tremendously depending on if you ask about politicians or ask about ordinary people. Oftentimes when we see measures of polarization, it's just people saying they don't like politicians. But actually true animosity, true dislike of the other side is disliking everyone who is associated with the other side. So in saying something like, how happy or unhappy would you be if you had a child who married somebody of the opposing side, we're really getting at this idea of bringing somebody into your family rather than a politician. So this was our measure. Now, what is sort of interesting about this measure, and this figure looked really different on the screen. Well, imagine that instead of like a really dark line, there are lots of dots looking like a cloud. And imagine it looks peaceful and beautiful too. And so in this, what's really interesting about this measure is that it stayed extraordinarily stable over all the waves in which we measured it. So even as people were experiencing all sorts of political events, we kept asking them this measure. We kept asking them how they felt about the other side, and it was remarkably stable across all the waves. We're also going to focus on a variety of outcomes. We're going to ask people how they feel about political issues. We're going to have evaluations of figures who are political and non-political, and figures who became political, like health officials. We're going to ask them about perceptions of compromise. We're going to ask them about perceptions of legislative interactions, so what you think about Congress, people interacting and working together. We're going to look at response to a crisis, which is COVID-19, and we're also going to look at their democratic attitudes, so how they feel about things like executive power. What do they think about kind of media freedom? And these ideas are going to get us at these perceptions of conditions of when disliking the other party might matter. Looking at these things like political issues, evaluations of figures, and compromise is going to tell us how often people just follow their party cue. In responding to a crisis, we're going to look at what happens when personal stakes and consequences actually come into tension with what your party is telling you to do. And in seeing things as political, we're going to look at democratic attitudes. So we look at these norms on which democracy is founded. Do people start to see them as partisan, as animosity increases? Because we're not going to talk for 3 hours. I'm going to focus on just a couple of things here. And so I'm going to focus on the perceptions of compromise and response to a crisis. So I'm going to look at 2 questions from the book, which are separate chapters from the book. The first is, how does this hostility, this dislike of the other party, shape perceptions of compromise in government? Right? What do you think the government should do? And the second is, what happens when this hostility intersects with a crisis? What happens when suddenly just following your party might come with a consequence to your life? And so I'm going to start with this question of compromise. The question here is, like, how do people feel about compromise generally? Before we think about what it means if you're polarized and you're thinking about compromise, how do you feel about it generally? Well, compromise is a tricky question. People love compromise in theory. They will be like, everyone should compromise literally all the time. When you give people examples of what it actually means for somebody to compromise in a political sense, they don't like it at all. Right? So it's sort of a tension. So if we have this kind of tension already that exists, how does actually disliking the other side intersect with your feelings about compromise? Well, I guess the question is, what is compromise? So what is compromise? In our book, we actually began with an idea offered by President Joe Biden. This is Joe Biden. He says, let me be clear, neither side got what they wanted in this deal, and that is compromise. And Biden offers us, right, President Biden offers us kind of the beginning of a definition for compromise, which is Well, you kind of both give something up. If nobody gives anything up, it's not really a compromise. Dutman and Thompson suggest the same thing. There has to be some sort of sacrifice. But the question is this sacrifice mutual? Right? In theory, did just one side give up everything in order to create some outcome? Now, when we think about how animosity might intersect with compromise, the first thing to say is that generally nobody likes sacrifice. Like nobody likes giving anything up for the sake of compromise. But we can think of different types of compromise. We can think of what we might call equitable compromise, in which both sides equally give something up. And we can think of what I'll term lopsided compromise, in which case, to kind of move legislation, to move policy forward, one side gives up more than the other side. And what we suggest is that as people start to dislike the other party, right, as people are more hostile to the other party, they're going to dislike any compromise. It's not going to matter if it's equitable or if it's lopsided. They're just not going to like it. They're just not want any compromise to begin with. But this polarization, this level of animosity to the other side, is especially going to exacerbate response to lopsided compromise when your party gives up more. So what are we going to do here? We're going to use our April 2021 wave. Animosity just again was measured in 2019. We do two things here. The first is we do a question wording study that just looks at compromise in the abstract. We just generally ask people, how often do you think politicians in Congress should compromise? How frequently do you think politicians should respect the other side? What we find here is essentially kind of what you'd expect, which is people who are higher in animosity, who more strongly dislike the other side, are less likely to say that it's important that their party compromises, but they're more likely to say it's important that the other side compromises. And they're also more likely to say that the other side really needs to respect their party, but they don't think their party needs to respect the other side. Okay, but what happens when we give people specifics about compromise? And so here we have an experiment where we're going to give people specific conditions for compromise. We're going to focus on negotiation over NASA funding. We picked NASA funding because our co-author Matt Lewandowski said, and I quote, "NASA is not really political." And then I gave this talk in Houston, and the audience was like, "What are you talking about?" NASA is extraordinarily political. So that's why I like to cite Matt as saying that NASA is not political. We're going to follow a design that was originally used by Harbridge et al., where we're going to give people specifics. So we're going to say, Biden and Democrats want to cut 200 million, Republicans want to cut 400 million. What is the compromise? And so here we have one lopsided side, which gets you closer to the Democratic cut, a lopsided cut that gets you closer to the Republicans, and a cut where everyone gives up something equivalently, so the equivalent compromise. So what do we see here? We're going to look at a lopsided compromise that favors your party, a lopsided compromise that favors the other party, and the equivalent one. Our outcomes are how you feel about this situation and what you think the cut should be. How much do you think should be cut? So does animosity matter? Okay. The first thing that I want to show you is this very flat line. What does this flat line mean? Well, on our x-axis are levels of animosity. So if you're here in the 5th percent of animosity, it means you generally aren't all that hostile to the other party. You're kind of fine with them. If you are over here, you're on the highest level of animosity. You really dislike the other party. So when we see a flat line like this, it actually means it doesn't matter where you are. There's no effect of animosity. And so what we see here is in the condition where there is an even split, both parties give up equivalently, animosity actually doesn't really matter. Everyone kind of feels the same way about what has happened. They somewhat favor it. What happens when it's more of a lopsided compromise? What we see here, and for some reason our confidence intervals are not rendering, which is sort of interesting. What we see here is that this is where animosity matters quite a bit. Here, as you become more hostile to the other side, you're much more supportive of this outcome. On the other hand, as you kind of get more hostile to the other side here, you're much less favorable toward this outcome. What is kind of especially equivalent here is which approach do you actually favor? People who are low animus, so they're below that 50th percentile point, they are kind of okay with the other side. Their preferred outcome is the equivalent split. They wanted both parties to give up the same way. But people who are higher in animus much preferred a compromise where their party got the most, where the other party kind of gave up a lot more. So how do people feel about compromise? Well, yeah, the people who are lower in animus, who feel better about the other party, do like compromise more. They still kind of don't like concessions, but they're okay when both sides give something up. It's people who are higher in animus that care more about which party gives something up. They really dislike concessions. They really dislike when their party makes any concessions. And so what's interesting here is that Jenny Wolak has this really interesting book where she suggests that legislators constantly believe that if they make any concession, someone's going to get extraordinarily angry at them. And so who's going to get angry at them? The people who are higher in animus. So these imaginary people angry at the legislators who, in Jenny Wolak's book, the legislators are afraid to compromise because of these people. This is what the higher animus people, the people who dislike the other side, behave like in our book. But what happens when all of this intersects with a crisis? And for that, I'm going to turn it over to John Barry Ryan.
So you're also going to get to learn what happens when you pull a starting pitcher who's got her fastball and go to the bullpen. And that's me. Okay, so we're getting now to this high personal stakes and high personal consequences situation. We're doing COVID second, though the book actually started with COVID, not just because timeline, that's where it came up first, but we had collected the animus data for other purposes. And then when COVID is happening, the sort of narrative is already, early on, partisan differences. And one that sort of makes sense because there's been partisan differences since the 18th century in the United States. But on the other hand, it doesn't quite make sense that it would be uniform. So who's having these partisan differences? And the second difference, second sort of thing we were dealing with is, at the time, Jana and I were both at Stony Brook University on Long Island in the New York area. And New York in March of 2020 was hit by COVID harder than any place in the country would ever be hit by COVID. And where we were was a very Republican area, a lot of Trump banners, a lot of Trump signs, but not a lot of difference in how people were responding. And so that was a puzzle we thought that our data that we had already collected could help us solve by now re-interviewing them and asking them about COVID, because you have these high personal stakes and these personal consequences, but there is still variation. So we're looking at partisan cues and personal consequences, and you have cues from both parties throughout COVID. They really start off a bit weak in March and April of 2020, and then strengthen throughout the election. And so you will, in the chapter in the book, certain things like Fauci, for example, gets polarized over time, doesn't start off that polarized. So we're gonna have some outcome measures to go through. In the first wave, we just asked about, well, how worried are you about COVID? Then we had behaviors, which was a list of things that you might have changed your behavior on because of COVID. I'm not gonna talk about perceived safety at all. Policy support, and in this we're gonna be doing just the first wave, and was essentially like, should both businesses be closed and things like that? Work from home, should that be going on? And then the last wave, we asked about the vaccine, because at that point, the vaccine had been approved for emergency use. Okay, and so we're going to measure threat in two different ways. Beginning in April 2020, which is the first thing I'm going to show you, it's about the number of cases in your geographic area. This is county level, in the 3 days prior to the interview, according to the New York Times. It's the average number of cases. If you look at the figures I'm presenting here, and you're like, and you buy the book, well, thanks for buying the book, and you look at the figures in the book, they don't look like this, because these figures are produced either for this paper that was published a few years ago in Nature Human Behavior, or just made for this presentation. We changed our statistical strategy in the actual book, and so the figures are a little bit different there. Then the ones that are produced just for this presentation were done in, we're talking about the personal experiences with COVID. Because in the first wave, there's a great variation about how hard communities are being hit. In the last wave, at this point, a lot of people have had COVID, a lot of people had experienced COVID. You know, some people, all they had, they just lost the taste of, their sense of taste. They had no other experience with it. Other people got very, very sick, obviously. So what you're looking at here, partisan animosity, the variable Jan has been talking about, on the x-axis. The various dependent variables will be on the y-axis. And then for presentational purposes, the right graph is going to be 25th percentile in terms of the number of cases in the area. The left graph is the 75th percentile. That's left and right for me, not you, but you get it. And it's so this is actually a continuous variable, but it's logged because New York and the New York counties are such an outlier that it would really skew the graph. And so that's a continuous variable but for our purposes, just for display purposes, we're going to just do the 25th and 75th. And what you can see is when you have the low cases, as partisan animosity increases, Republicans are less likely to say that they are worried. In the high cases, no partisan difference. Again, when the personal consequences are higher, people are more likely to, partisan divisions go away. Now, we don't see that with behavior exactly. And there's two reasons for this, we believe. The first is in the low case example in April of 2020, people were still forced to stay at home. There were still shutdown orders and things like that. And so even Republicans who are high in animus had to change their behavior somewhat. So that was sort of a force. But what you'll notice is that the high impact case, the Republicans actually do, the low animus Republicans do respond more in saying they've changed more behaviors than in the low stakes case. If we look at policies, should things be shut down or whatnot, the confidence intervals overlap. These ones do display. But at the high animus level, there is a statistically significant difference when there's obviously not at the high end, the high stakes case where the partisan difference has gone away completely. By a year later, we have the vaccine. More people have had personal experience with COVID. So we've now changed to a more direct measure. And what do you get here? Again, now the low impact graph, these are people who don't know anyone who had severe COVID, people who knew someone who had severe COVID, and this is predicted behaviors. And what you see is now Republicans are saying, I'm not doing anything if they're high animus. If you know someone with severe COVID, the partisan gap doesn't go away. Everybody on the high animus end sort of increases. Now animus does not matter for Republicans. Animus does matter for Democrats. We do see animus mattering for Democrats in a number of ways in some of these things. For example, some Democrats reported paying, essentially not sleeping and paying attention to COVID so much who are high animus Democrats. And so you can imagine that the worry there is sort of higher, driven potentially by things besides just animus for the partisan gap there. And then when we look at the vaccine, you know, a clear difference between the people who don't know anyone with severe COVID and the people who do. When people do know someone who had severe COVID, overwhelmingly no partisan gap in terms of vaccine uptake. But Republicans who say they don't know anyone who had severe COVID and have high partisan animosity were reporting not only did they not get the vaccine, they were not going to get the vaccine. And this is also consistent with surveys at the time that said that people over 60 and 70 who were more at threat from severe death from COVID than people who are in their 20s and 30s were more likely to get the vaccine regardless of party. So anyway, the point of this is, when does animosity matter? It matters in some cases when the issue is less consequential. When personal consequences are high, then those things start to kick in and you go beyond partisanship. And so if you're asking sort of like, why does everything seem so divided by partisanship? Well, in one case, it's because when stakes are important, things are divided because people have different values and different standpoints and different beliefs about what would be the best outcome. So you will see partisan differences when things are really consequential. But you'll also see partisan differences when things are not consequential, because this is now my opportunity to differentiate myself and make it clear that I'm not one of the bad guys. And so for this group of high animus people, it's always an opportunity to say, I'm going to reinforce my values, even on things even when the stakes are low. So what's the role of animosity? It's not unconditional. It's not uniform. There are political consequences. And it matters in perceptions of politics, right? It correlates with democratic values. One of the things we didn't present to you is that you actually get, when you ask people sort of like what democratic values should support, you get a split. And not in our data, but in other data, supposedly you can see a switch in, like, for example, should the executive be constrained? Well, in January, we might have a different executive, and people's opinions on that might change based on the high animus people might say, oh, yes. Those who are saying yes now may decide in January no. And those who are saying no now may decide in January that they'd say yes. That is not, we still didn't tell you what's going to happen next week, in 2 weeks. Anyway, and again, partisan animosity may matter the most when issues matter the least to people, because that frees you up, that you don't have to consider anything. I can just think about politics, and I can think about expressing my political opinions in ways without worrying about the consequences it might have on me. Thank you for your time. And we have some time for questions, and I'd like to invite Yana back up here. Cal may take questions. We're not going to make questions. And there's a mic or something, right? Oh, there's a microphone back there. Okay. Thank you. Gavin's going to ask a question.
I was going to save the annoying one for a little later, but I'm curious. One of the other critiques of some of the work on affective polarization and its null consequences is about linear assumptions, the Janssen and Turkenberg paper. And I'm curious if you see any evidence of that here. You didn't present the democratic norms element, and that's what their paper focuses on. I'm curious if for COVID or for support for compromise, you see the sort of inverted U-shaped dynamic they talk about, or not, and if not, why?
So we don't see an inverted U-shape, but the reason why we changed the analytical strategy is part for nonlinearity, right? Sort of this thing that in the first book, in the Other Divide book, we have this involvement measure, how much you care about politics, and it's only the people in the top 25th percentile who are then affectively polarized or have higher levels of affective polarization. And so when we did the analysis for this book, we went non-parametric, did these smoothers, and you do get, sometimes you'll get straight lines, but oftentimes you'll get this thing where it like hits a tipping point, where if I'm low animus, I look exactly like the average level of animus. We didn't show this here, but it's essentially a normal distribution with a small bump. And then, you get straight line and then boom, straight down. And so because of that consistently happening, that's why we didn't do the straight line. But no, we didn't see a sort of a U shape where the people low on animus behave a certain way. Although I guess maybe you could see that happening. The compromise thing sort of suggested that a little bit, because I don't know if it suggested it, but because the low animus people, they didn't like either party to give up anything, right? So at least they are, in that way, they were acting differently than the typical person at the 50th percentile, the median, and then obviously different from the people who are at the high end. So But definitely, this is not necessarily a linear experience, despite all the fancy straight lines I showed you in the COVID graphs, at least.
But the tipping point is hard. I think it would be difficult to say at what point like a tipping point happens, just because of the way that people answer questions too.
Earlier, you showed a figure about how, as like political events are happening, the sentiment towards other parties, the other party is pretty stable. Do you have a sense of like, if the events actually do have an impact on sentiment and they just have like a low, like they're just not very persistent, or if the events actually just don't shift the mood at all, even like right after these events happen?
So, all right, I'm not gonna comment on what happens immediately after. I will say that in terms of other people who've looked at the stability of affect, and specifically affective polarization here, so these measures, they are really, really stable. Because a lot of people right around, I remember during COVID times, a lot of people had these hypotheses that this was going to increase animosity. And I remember in all of these cases, when people tested the hypothesis, it ended up staying fairly stable. Now, is it plausible that in like an experimental context, I could bring somebody in and I could show them new information that could give that bump? I think that is plausible. In fact, the research by Volkel et al. Is depolarization. So they're giving people information hoping to make them less polarized. And that does have an effect in the setting, but the effect dissipates over time. And so the question is, does it dissipate because it was just a short-term bump? Does it dissipate because after people leave the experimental context, they go back out into the real world and kind of are exposed to all this information? That's, I think, tough. But in general, there is a lot of kind of cases, and our co-author, Jamie Druckman, actually writes about it in his book on experiments, that affective polarization as an outcome measure has been something that very few people have been able to move.
Just wondered if you could comment about how this may play out differently across key demographic groups or regions, age cohorts, other kinds of, groupings like that. Thank you.
Yeah, so when we look at, and I'm going to also in the other divide in our other book, we specifically look at demographic characteristics that predict involvement and then correlates with polarization. A giant predictor, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is level of education. So the more educated you are, the more involved you are, also the more polarized you are. There's some evidence, though it's less consistent for income as well. So people who are wealthier tend to be more polarized in that respect.
Yeah, and I think the other thing we'll note, right, is that certainly in our data and other data we've analyzed and other data other people analyzed, Democrats tend to be higher on animus than Republicans. And possibly that's because of education polarization and Democrats being more educated now, possibly because the highest animus Republicans will not answer the surveys. That's also a possibility. But the other interesting thing is we asked the same polarization questions in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And what you find there is ideological extremity heavily predicts polarization about the Labour and Conservative parties. But actually, and Brexit as well, but actually, and involvement predicts it, as we said, but actually they give higher, more polarized responses to when we ask them, what do you think about the Democratic and Republican parties, than when they are asked about their own parties, suggesting that really what's going on here is it's not just about partisan identities, but it's also about, I'm very good at identifying who the good people are and the bad people are. And especially Labor supporters know the Republicans are the bad people. And so they are very unwilling to say, if my kid went to America and married a Republican, I ain't having that. And so that's sort of another way, another example where it's of differences. Who's higher on animus is people probably who view the world in that sort of way, the goodies and the baddies.
Oh, I think that's a question.
So if animus is so hard to affect, then where did the existing differences come from? Sorry, I'm so outside of this literature. Is it coming from education and the fraction of people who have a college education has increased over time, or are there other things, or is it just not a true stylized fact that polarization has increased over time?
Yeah. So I think that's a great question. So where is it coming? So I think when I'm talking about difficult to move, I mean in terms of an experimental treatment. So what that suggests is that kind of a single shot in an experimental study is not going to move your level of affective polarization. That can be for a couple of reasons. It might be because it's so stable, like you're bringing so much of it with you that a new piece of information in an experiment is just not going to move you in any way. So that's kind of one thing. But I think the question of where it comes from is a much bigger question. There are a lot of people who've been trying to look at that. It's incredibly, incredibly challenging. So some people have focused on looking at the ideas of social media, for example, but that's something that's been kind of contested. There are folks who suggest that having this exposure via social media to new people, these new ideas, expression, has increased these levels of polarization. That's been really contested. Other research suggests that in theory, our increased social connections could increase it. So if I'm in a social network and I'm extraordinarily polarized, and that's the messages other people get, that to be a good partisan, you have to be polarized, they're more likely to report now that there's polarization. That's an argument that Liz Connors makes, for example. Other people have, connected it to changes, rhetorical changes, for example, in American politics. But again, a really tough argument to make causally in some sense as well. So to me, when these kinds of things happen, it suggests that it's probably a soup of everything, right? Changes in the media environment, changing in the rhetorical environment, changing in how we make connections with others. I think it's probably might also be changes in survey measurement of how we started to measure it, what we're looking for, and who's taking surveys as well.
Oh, and then also, and so one argument also is that it would be like the parties have changed, right? Not just becoming more ideologically polarized, but becoming more ideologically distinct, right? So if this were 1965 and I were to ask you where the Democrats stand on, certainly 1960, maybe 1965 too, yeah, definitely, where the Democrats stand on civil rights, you'd have to say, what Democrats? You're talking about Southern Democrats, you're talking about Northern Democrats, who are you referring to? And because there's sort of differences there, people are unable to necessarily, with their dislike of whatever it is, they don't necessarily connect to party in a way that they would today. And then you just said something about social connections. I don't know. But yeah, so that could be a possibility too. Oh, I know what I was gonna say. But part of the problem is, they asked this question, Amin and Verba asked the question in 1960 about the family situation, and they get higher levels of polarization in the UK than they do in the US. And then I think people are like, well, I guess people in the US aren't polarized. Let's stop asking this question. There's no point in asking this.
Yeah.
And so then you have this blank period where then suddenly in like 2000 or so, people are like, oh, people are polarized. And then they start asking the question again. And so you see that movement, but it's like this 40, 50-year gap. You're like, well, what happened in those years? Was it a linear increase? Did it suddenly jump? But then there's also this problem where people have swapped out the party items and put in, relevant to the World Series, Yankees, Mets, or Yankees, Red Sox, Dodgers, Giants, that sort of thing. And you get similar levels of percentages of people who are polarized by that. So it could also just be that, sort of like what Jan was saying that Liz says earlier, I'm just supposed to say I've got strong opinions, and these are strong opinion people. This is, again, involvement, not polarization, but the involved people are more likely to post on social media about politics because it measures political involvement. They're more likely to post about sports, movies, their health, their families, et cetera, et cetera. So this may just be people who are like, I have opinions, I have strong opinions, and maybe that's increased because of climate. But you had that problem where for 20 years or 30 years, nobody was considering this, and then it took off.
Hello. I was just wondering how you dealt with those of us who are independents, and specifically a big Bernie Sanders supporter, since when he was speaking, I thought I was listening to the founding fathers of the nation in his attitude, and he was sidelined, though he's given, chairmanships on different things, but he doesn't get any voice. And it's like, here, you either pick this bad guy or that bad guy. And the Pope himself, I'm not Catholic, I'm a Lutheran, but he said that it's a lesser of two evils, and I can't understand how a democracy can thrive by picking the lesser of two evils.
So there's two answers to that question. In the data we showed you, those people don't exist. So there's that, right? Because we can't necessarily, it's hard to put in party ways. In other things, like in the other divide book, when we were looking at polarization, there we just did the differences between the two parties, right? So there's certainly independents who look at these two groups and say they're both bad. There are some, but not many, who say they're both good. There are some who look at them and they're both like, eh. But there are some independents who are like, these are the bad guys, and then there's these guys, right? And so they would be somewhat polarized, right? So we look at absolute differences there. And then, in the case of the UK stuff, lots more party switching, lots more party identity switching. And so there, it's just this sort of absolute difference in what are you getting at? And so again, there it's ideological extremity matters more than these partisan identity measures. And so you could imagine that that even the people on the far left or the far right who are like, there's no party that represents me. A good portion of them are saying that party really doesn't represent me. And that can have certain consequences, certainly for this. It might have different consequences for participation, for donation, these things we didn't look at. But that is an interesting point about like the problem. Well, you wrote a book about independence, so why don't you talk about independence? I mean, the problem with measuring independence.
Yeah, the problem with measuring independence is that a lot of people do use the independent question, right? So you identified as being a genuine independent. A lot of people do use the independent question to have a survey way out of answering the partisanship question, in part because they don't want to talk about their partisanship. So factoring independence into a survey kind of work is difficult in that regard, because it's never clear when somebody is sort of trying to signal something about not wanting to speak about partisanship versus genuinely having a lack of connection to either side.
Because one of the things we didn't talk about, right, though, is that this high animosity group is low. And one of the ways you can get rid of the sort of measure on some of this stuff is to say, on the one hand, here's this person, they're from the other party, and they're going to marry your child, and they're never going to talk about politics. And now people are like, oh, this is fine. Another way to get rid of the polarization, though, is to say, here's this person, they're from your party. It was like, great. And they talk about politics all the time. I do not want this. Get that person away from me. And so for the bulk of people, politics is a realm of conflict. It's a realm of discomfort. I don't want to be dealing with this, right? And so that's sort of the difficulty with independence, is because there is that group. I'm just out of it. I'm not part of it. And then there's the group that's like, these parties don't represent me. I have strong values. I have strong values, and I'm not seeing them. And so lumping them together becomes quite difficult, right? Anyway.
Well,
If there's one more. Okay. The gentleman who's leaving.
I was just curious, especially about the animus measure. It seems like by focusing on parties, you're leaving out candidates. And it seems like the candidate, if I think of voting, or I think of my animus towards John McCain, and then I think of Donald Trump, I mean, that's like 0 to 100. So
Sure.
I don't know how you do that in your.
well, those are two actually, that's an interesting point, but those are, way two different questions that have emerged, right? So the research that emerges on animus is specifically about how you feel about ordinary people. And the argument that the folks started with, who like Shanto Iyengar, and Yevlokis, Gaurav Sood, who start with, is the idea that you have a profound polarization once your animus moves beyond the candidate, right? Once it moves into the general public, where anyone who has a potentially minimal affiliation with the other side, rather than being ostensibly the representative of the party in a general election, that is a signal of a level of polarization. And that is in part why Iyengar and co-authors, when they switch to the measure about the family, argue that it is in fact that profound, that it's not necessarily a dislike to somebody who holds, could have really strong implications over your life by being elected to office, but rather somebody who is a member of the public who just identifies as a component of the party.
And one more thing, and this is something that's in the COVID data that it's not in the book, it's in the thing we published separately. But the people who are low on animus, and especially the people who are moderate on animus, they are partisans. Like, there's no way that the moderate animus Democrat is wondering who they're voting for this November. And the same with the moderate animus Republican, and in many cases, the low one animus one. So when you ask them, how is Donald Trump doing in responding to COVID? All the Republicans say he's doing a great job. All the Democrats say he's doing a terrible job. But then you ask, how is the United States doing? And you get an animus split, because the high animus people say Trump is the United States. Politics is so central to me. He's that. If he's doing a bad job, we're doing a bad job. If he's doing a good job, we're doing a good job. The low animus people, the moderate animus people, these are separate things, right? And so that's part of the thing, is that if you're able to separate out the people in the party, you're probably not high animus. If the party, the people, that's all the same, the citizens, the politicians, I hate them all. No matter what we do, we can't move you. You are high animus. So that's, that would be how we're dealing with that. Anyway, well, thank you very much for your time. I hope the sandwich was good. We didn't get to have them. I didn't want to.